All right. Well, whoa, that's loud. We'll get started now. This is FLADotNet Coders Cafe, and some events coming up. We have IT Palooza coming up in December. If you know anybody who wants to sponsor, we're interested in sponsors, and there's going to be a lot of sessions. I think they'll still more of a IT marketing, but some developer stuff for sure. Are you doing a JS track?
Yes.
You want to talk about it?
Yeah, sure. So if you guys are interested, we were going to do a workshop for JavaScript. So zero to hero, the same thing you always heard about it. So it'll get you everything up to date with your JavaScript skills. Everybody needs JavaScript regardless of what language you use in the back end. And it's free. So if you're in IT Palooza, you pay the $90.
I don't know what.
Whatever the ticket is, you automatically get that workshop for free. So you're welcome to come in and out of that workshop. You're welcome to see what's going on. So if there wasn't already enough reason with some amazing vendors and amazing talks, there's a whole free workshops in JavaScript to get yourself up to date with exactly what you need.
And I'll be on an IoT workshop. That's just, yeah, it's December 8th, Thursday. And coming up in February 29th, 2020 is the 16th Code Camp, but we're kind of rebranding it to be the South Florida Software Developer Conference and doing it in conjunction with Tech Lauderdale. Anybody have any other announcements or anything they want to talk about? Anybody hiring anybody, looking for a job? Anybody want to talk? Going once? All right, well tonight we have Hervé Rogero to talk about Azure versus AWS SQL.
Yes.
We don't need that.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Maybe I do need this. Test, test. Hello, hello. Hello? Oh, yeah. Ooh. Well, just a bit less.
Less?
Yeah, thank you. That's probably fine. Yep, perfect, thank you. All right, hi, everyone. So before I get started, I'm curious. First of all, who works for Microsoft tonight? If anybody is here for Microsoft. It's okay. Yes, all right. Sounds good. Maybe, all right. Still needs to be louder? All right. And anyone working for Amazon? No. All right, just checking. So, all right, that's good? Voice? All right, sounds good. Yeah, for sure.
So why Microsoft? Why do we?
All right, so tonight's presentation is comparing perhaps the most fundamental service that you can have in any cloud provider, which is where your data is going to be stored. There's multiple databases, multiple database engines that you can choose from. I've decided to focus specifically on the Microsoft SQL Server platform. And I spent quite some time over the last 10 plus years working on the Azure platform, and for the last couple of years I've been involved with the AWS platform a little bit more, and that kind of gave me the opportunity to step back and look at what were the pros and the cons of each. So some of you know me from multiple past presentations, and as a past MVP and on the Microsoft Azure platform, sometimes it's hard to step back and have an as candid and unbiased view of what we use as technology platforms. So I tried to do that, and that took me down a path I wasn't really expecting. And it turns out to be even more and more content. So over the last few weeks, I spent hours trying to study the differences between the two. And I had a first blog that came out a couple of weeks ago on the C# Corner website that started to look at very key elements of both platforms. The second blog came out today, where I'm looking at a couple more, including security. And I still have more work. And the more I go into it, the more I want to find out what's left and what else there is. And I'm planning a third blog post as well, coming further down the pike, related to scalability And so depending on where you look at, in some cases, you'll find out that the AWS platform makes sense for certain scenarios. And in others, it makes sense to go in the Azure cloud. So what I'm going to try to do tonight is give you a high-level overview. I can't really go too deep for a few reasons. One of them being that the deeper you go, the more things do change, and the harder it becomes to compare apples to apples. So I try to stay a little bit higher level. So that's what we'll do tonight. Right. So we'll take a look at the what are the primary differences between the two platforms. So we'll take a look at the offering itself. The high-level connectivity capabilities of both platforms. Some of the limitations that you might experience from a T-SQL programming standpoint. Availability story, the licensing aspect, the security and backup capabilities of the platforms, and then a little bit into scalability. And so please keep in mind that this deck will evolve as I learn more and as I continue to build my story. So tonight you guys are my, guinea pigs. Right? So my name is Hervé Ruggiero. I am the founder of Blue Syntax, which makes the Enzo platform, Enzo product line. And you can learn more on this website and follow me on Twitter as well if you're interested. I don't speak much on Twitter, but once in a while I say something, so I don't spam. So let's kind of define a little bit the scope tonight. I'm interested in high-level SQL Server as a service, so the DB platform as a service discussion. I will not enter the virtual machine space. I will not go into comparing VM versus EC2 and all that jazz. I will stick to Amazon versus Microsoft. I'm not going to go anywhere else at this point. I'll stay at high-level differences with pros and cons. And I am not ready yet to talk about performance discussions. We'll talk a little bit of availability and scalability to a certain degree, but performance tonight is going to be a little bit out of scope. There's more for me to learn about. Okay. So, from an offering standpoint, right away you start seeing some major differences. On the Azure side, what you have is that you always run on the latest binaries. Microsoft has shifted over the last few years into a cloud-first approach, which means no matter however you want to slice and dice it in the database as a platform world, when you get a database on the Azure platform, you get SQL Server 2019 or a flavor of such, and you're going to be running the Enterprise Edition whether you want it or not. So you get all the capabilities in one. So you really have, one version. And then there are, there's a variety of offerings, however, within that. So although you get that one dedicated, unique version of the database engine, you get different offerings. On the Amazon side, what you get is more of a version-driven deployment option. So you can choose from SQL Server 2012 all the way up to 2017. 2019 is not yet available on the Amazon platform, as of today at least. And then you choose the edition that you want. Do you want Express? Do you want Standard? Do you want Enterprise? Et cetera, et cetera. And then what's really important to understand is that on the Amazon platform, what you're getting is a dedicated instance. You literally get a VM that you can't really log into because you don't manage the operating system level. That's Amazon does that for you. But you get an instance. It's yours. You're not sharing any of this. It's yours. On the Microsoft side, traditionally you've had the single database, used to be called SQL database offering. It has evolved a little bit from a marketing standpoint, but you have the single instance or the elastic pool offering, which is just a variation of the first, and that's a shared deployment model. Or you can have a managed instance, which is also more of a dedicated model. So you can think just, if you try to do kind of really high level, you could say that perhaps the managed instance instance offering of the Azure database is a little bit closer to the AWS offering, but you still don't get the ability to choose, the edition or the version, right? But you go into the instance deployment model. So, any questions on that? Does that make sense? Right. And so, of course, the first thing that comes out of this is that on the Azure side, you will always get the latest and greatest as soon as it's available. And while in some cases that's really good, in other cases it might actually hurt you a little bit if your application stack is not ready for the latest and greatest. And so specifically for all the applications and companies that are looking for more of a fork and lift type model, saying I don't want to change my code because I know it works. You're trying to look for that square where you don't want to have to change, or as little as possible. Going into the Amazon platform sometimes can be a little bit easier, right? Sir? I'm sorry?
Does that mean it'll only launch instances on the latest version? Like if you've got one a while back, will it update that too, or is the old one going to stay the same?
Did you hear the question?
No. Could you repeat one more time? Sorry.
If you made an instance of the Azure SQL database a while back, will it be updated for you, or is it?
Yes.
Oh, it is.
Yeah. It continues to grow. Yes.
So
absolutely.
you have to make sure that your code is updated.
Yeah, and for the most part, what Microsoft has tried to do over the years is to make things more and more backward compatible. So running the risk of something breaking can potentially happen, but it usually was more true in the earlier versions of your database engine upgrades. So if you today have an app that runs on 2012 and you're looking for a migration path, you're going to have to go to 2019, which is multiple revision upgrades. And so that by nature, it's going to be more risky than if you go into a 2012 environment. However, that's the easy way out. Maybe, there are pros and cons to both, right? So the story on the connectivity side of things, you can expect because on the Azure side you have more of a database deployment model where every database runs on a different server. The connectivity engine is a little bit different than on Amazon. On Amazon, it's a straight story, just like what you have on-prem or on existing data centers. You connect directly to a DNS name from your application, right? There's no magic there. It's a very established model. On the Azure side, you have a little bit of a different story if you're talking about the managed instance or the single database deployment model. The single database deployment model, which was the first one available made available by Microsoft originally, has a gateway connectivity model. And the gateway means that since you never know where your database is actually hosted, you have to go through a gateway that then redirects you to the right database, to the right server for your database. So that's the single instance database model. On the managed instance, it's closer to the AWS implementation. Recently, Microsoft introduced the redirected connectivity model for single databases. And what this means is that although your database may be hosted on different servers at any point in time, you're going to go through the gateway once, and once you're redirected to the proper server, you stay there. So you have more of a direct connection. This was done for performance reasons, because imagine having to go through the gateway every single time, not just from a connection standpoint, but from issuing your commands and request and response all the time going through the gateway can become a significant performance bottleneck. And so that's why the redirection model was implemented. So there is a laundry list of limitations when it comes to SQL commands. And I apologize, we could stay on this slide probably for 30 minutes, but suffice to say that there are differences, and some of the differences are publicly available. Some of them is you're going to have to try yourself. It's not because it's listed here that it may or may not be accurate by the time you try. Things change all the time. If it's not listed, it doesn't mean that it's going to be working either. So just be careful with that. Some advanced options are not necessarily publicly available. So some things to kind of note, for example, is on RDS, you have the ability to backup commands like native, which is now available on the managed side of the Azure offering, but it's not provided for the single database instance model. And when I say, to be clear, when I say the single database model, I also talk about Elastic Pool. It's virtually the same offering. It's just different manageability capabilities. Right? You can see file stream is not supported anywhere. Log shipping is not available, right? And so on and so forth. So, what you can expect, however, is that the AWS offering and the managed Azure database offering is going to give you more options. You'll have more compatibility surface than if you were to go with a single database instance. And Microsoft started with the middle column there, the single instance. And so at the very beginning of the database service offering, it was hard sometimes to get some things to work because there was a significant gap from a T-SQL capability. And the gaps are being closed over time, and then the managed instance is closing a lot of those gaps, right? But you still have some limitations. And it's also worth noting that some of the capabilities are available depending only if you choose the right service level of the database that you're selecting. And in some cases, the feature is more or less replaced by other things that is provided around the service. So it's not because it's not available as a T-SQL capability that you can't do it. Like backups. For example, the backup command itself is not available for the Azure SQL database. That's true. However, the platform gives you the ability to do backups, right? So there's things like that, right? Any questions before I switch? Yep.
Could you just point out the differences on high availability? Because you've got an asterisk on optional, yes, and they're all asterisked with limited to this service.
Yes. So thank you. Yeah. So some of these asterisks are there because sometimes the differences can be really long. So in this presentation, I decided not to go to this level of detail. It can be really complicated. However, I will address availability specifically a little bit later in this presentation. Okay? There we go. So on the AWS side of things, something that kind of surprised me at first when I started to work with on the Amazon platform is that when you get a database instance, you don't have to have any kind of high availability or any kind of SLA. It's possible to just have a single instance, a single server, and that's it. If it could go down any time for maintenance or a variety of reasons. So you can actually obtain a database instance with no HA whatsoever. It's not really an option in the Azure SQL database world. Everything comes already with high availability. And that's kind of an interesting thing. It's, on one side, you might say, I don't need it for a dev environment. Why do I need to bother with that? And on the Amazon side, it matters a little bit because when you want high availability, it only comes, when you have it's not available for lower editions, but then the licensing cost doubles, right? Because now you have to pay for your secondary node, right? So once you enable high availability in the Amazon side, then you get 99.95% monthly availability. That's according to the Amazon SLA, published SLAs. It used to be that Amazon was not using so I say availability groups, that's if it's supported. If you choose 2012, it wouldn't be availability groups. It might be log shipping or something like this, right? And so on the Azure side, you have a couple of different availability models depending on what you choose. So if you choose the single database model, then you have automatically secondary databases. There's actually more than one. There's a couple. But conceptually, you have secondary databases that are available that can pick up in case the primary goes down. Or the primary can go down for maintenance reasons, for a variety of reasons, right? On the managed instance, you have secondary replicas with availability groups, which allows you to have multiple secondaries, and depending on the service level that you choose, one of the secondaries can actually be made available for reads, so that you could have and redirect your reads on a different server than the primary. Okay. And so this gives you some interesting options on the managed instance side of the Azure offering. Right. So the question is, so you cannot have an instance in SQL without some form of redundancy. That's my understanding. That's correct. Yep. From a cost standpoint, it doesn't mean it's more expensive, and that's the interesting piece. It's that because Microsoft controls all the elements of the equation, right? They control the hardware, they control the licensing because it's theirs, and they control the source code because it's theirs. So Microsoft has obviously a competitive advantage in being able to create, and we'll see this again in a future slide, to create a service that just cannot be replicated anywhere else. Right. So let's talk about licensing, and this is really complicated. I don't think this slide does it justice in terms of how in-depth licensing details can be, right? But I just wanted to stay, again, high level. With AWS RDS SQL Server, you can no longer bring your license. This has been now for a year or two. That's what I mentioned a minute ago with the muscle power of being able to control all the elements. Amazon can no longer provide BYOL, which means on that side, you must purchase a license included model for SQL Server. Now, of course, if you pick an Express edition, it's a non-issue because it's license-free anyways. But if you want to go in a higher standard edition or enterprise edition, Amazon will have to collect the licensing piece of the price, right? On the Azure SQL database side of things, for the single instance and the Elastic Pool offering, you can choose either a vCore model or a DTU model. Right. So I don't know if you guys have heard the DTU model, but it's kind of a capacity that mixes. It's a zone of performance that's typical for application that mixes IOPS, memory, and CPU. So it's a little bit fuzzy in terms of what it exactly gives you. But you have charts on the Microsoft side that can try to guide you on what DTU is. But it's not directly a core model. What does DTU mean? Database transaction unit or something? Yeah, database. It's a database transaction unit, I think. I may be wrong, but I think it's that. Yeah, yeah. And so it basically represents a workload of some kind. And so the higher the workload, the higher the DTU, the more capacity you get. That's going to mix I/O, IOPS, memory, and CPU. On the vCore side of the, and this is what it used to be before. That's all that was available. Recently, well, in a few months or maybe a couple of years now, but the vCore model came. So now you can say that you want to go from a vCore standpoint and have virtual core licensing, in which case you can, if you want, optionally, bring your license in the vCore model. Yeah. Database throughput unit. Thank you, Dave. Throughput, not transaction. Yeah. Yeah. On the managed instance, you can also choose both, either pay as you go or bring your license. Mm-hmm. There's a long list at the bottom. There's a long URL at the bottom that of that slide that gives you some key differences for the benefits of bringing a license. Right? And specifically on the Microsoft side, and the reason this is an interesting competitive advantage is that you can get some significant cost reduction when you bring a license into the Azure platform. Backup. Ooh. So at first I thought there was going to be like a ton of differences, but the differences lie in the low-level detail of the implementation of the backup. From a customer standpoint, you have the ability to do backups. And what's really important is that both platforms will give you a recovery point objective of 5 minutes in some way, shape, or form. Right? When you enable backups. Backups are optional. So something to kind of note here is that the retention period is actually dictated by the service level that you pick for your database instance. And you have the ability recently on the Azure platform to have a long-term retention option for your single databases and elastic pools, which means if you have a requirement to store data from a backup standpoint for a decade, you can, up to a decade. Something as well that I thought was important to mention, which kind of goes back to the way the offerings are built and the way Amazon has to do its service implementation, is that ironically at the instance level in Amazon, when you do a backup, you back up the instance. You don't back up a database necessarily. You don't back up the whole instance, which means if you do a restore and you create a new instance from a restore, you get the whole enchilada. You get all the databases that were backed up from that instance. On the Azure side, that's not possible, not yet. So there's a workaround, which I have a link at the bottom that leads you to an article on TechNet that shows you how you can potentially do that for a managed instance. But conceptually, for single instances and single database or database pool, single elastic pools, you have every database is it's on its own server, right? There's no concept of an actual instance on a server. It's a logical construct. So when you create a backup for a database, you just get that one database. Right? Security is another really large topic, and this is kind of my summary slide on the security side of things. So generally speaking, you get roughly the same basic security options. You have firewall capabilities, you have SSL encryption at rest, SQL authentication and Active Directory authentication. It's a little bit funky on how it's done in AWS, but it works. You have auditing capabilities that's native from the SQL Server engine, and additional as well. Both platforms offer advanced auditing and monitoring capabilities, just differently. And then the Azure platform will go a little bit further, and I'll go back to this in a second. But what's really important to understand is that on the Azure side, you don't have a choice. You always have SSL. You always have encryption at rest. And you always have a firewall, which that's true as well for AWS. But the encryption at rest and in transit on the AWS side are optional. And I had to kind of go back to my, go back to the drawing board and thinking, well, do I want that as a customer? Is this okay to have an unencrypted data store? Is it okay to have an unencrypted traffic on my database instance? Well, that's perhaps a matter of opinion. And I can see where some people, if you just look at it purely technically, you can make an argument and say, well, for some environments that are non-sensitive, maybe you can get by with not having encryption on your disk, in which case maybe you get a little bit of performance improvement. But beyond that, it's really hard to make the case why you wouldn't want to have encryption all around. Going back to the early days of cloud computing, and when back in the late 90s started to do all these discussions about, oh, well, we're going to do business transactions online. How do we secure this? How about my financial information? So it was all about a matter of trust. And it really is kind of the same thing here. It's a matter of trust. So Microsoft has chosen that it was not an option. Encryption, just like high availability, is non-negotiable. So on the Amazon side, you do have the option, good or bad. Of course, encryption at rest can be done different ways. So you can have disk level encryption, or you can have transparent data encryption, right, from the SQL engine. On the AWS side, to use TDE, you would need to have to be on the Enterprise Edition. Right? In addition to kind of I'm going to call those kind of the basic features, security features, you also have additional capabilities that are only available on the Azure platform, and these are really important to mention. You have advanced threat protection, and you have data masking. Now, I have not personally played with those other than looking at configuration screens just to see what they were about. And you have some really advanced capabilities. So if you are an enterprise going into the cloud and looking at your options, security is definitely something you might want to look very carefully into. Data masking. So this is the ability to dynamically modify data on its way back, depending on who you are. So you may not be able to see a full social security number. You may see SXX dash, right? So the question was, is TDE required or is it on by default? So I may be wrong, but I believe, you're talking about the Azure side? Yeah. So on the Azure side, my understanding is that because this is always enterprise, you'll get TDE always. But I could be wrong. Anyone disagrees with that? Or I think I believe that's the case. Yes. Right. On the firewall side of things, just a little bit more on that. The SQL database offering was initially built so that you could access it directly from the public internet. and also from within, the Azure data centers. But the use case was definitely also for being able to get directly into your database without going through, networks and security groups or anything like this. You could literally connect through by IP, right? And so right off the get-go, Microsoft had to put in place a specific firewall capability on top of its SQL database engine to make sure that not everybody would just connect from anywhere all the time. I remember back in, was it like late 80s or early 90s, I was playing with a database server that I put on the public internet. It didn't take 24 hours before I realized it was completely hacked. And this was like 30 years ago, right? So, maybe not 30, but a while back, yeah. So there is a very specific firewall connectivity rule that you need to be aware of when you have a SQL database or Elastic Pool deployment, which allows you to have a very flexible, IP filtering capability, right? On the AWS side, you have a similar concept. It works a little bit differently, but you can also apply through what's called the security groups. You apply your TCP/IP filtering on the security group so that you can get into your database from a public endpoint if you wanted to, right? The firewall, that firewall I'm talking about for Azure is not available for the managed instance. There is no firewall. The managed instance of offering of Microsoft isn't really designed for public access into it, so you don't have that same firewall definition. You actually have to go through networks to get into, through VPN, for example, to get into it, which means you have other firewalls, network level firewalls to get to your database. So here's kind of the high-level summary of the security features of RDS SQL Server and Azure. And again, although the firewall is not a feature of the database of the managed service, you have, of course, network-level firewalls to get there, right? One interesting aspect of having firewall defined on in a SQL database single instance model is that they are portable because they're created within the database itself, literally. So if you back up your database and you restore it somewhere else, the same firewall rules will basically be applied. Right? Yeah, this whole portable concept of a database is yeah, that's pretty cool. Any questions on this? All right, and then from a scalability standpoint, I specified on the left on AWS, you can go up to 48 cores, 384 gigabytes of RAM. It's roughly the same thing on the Azure side. I think it is actually the same thing. Yeah, you can go a little bit higher. I think there's like 80. So 48 is virtual cores that. We have an equivalent offering on the Azure side, but what's really important to me on the scalability side, and I see this all the time from a DevOps standpoint, is not just the ability to scale up, but the ability to scale down. And how far down can you turn that knob when you don't need that much? Specifically for dev test scenarios, specifically for just trying things out. Sometimes you really want to turn it down without going to a lower environment from an edition standpoint. You still want all the features that you need of the Enterprise Edition or Standard Edition, but you want to be able to go all the way down to small servers. On the AWS side, unfortunately, that's much harder to do. You literally have to change your edition level to go to lower class machines. It's a little bit like having to choose between 4, 5, or 6 options in AWS Enterprise Edition. But of course in Azure, because it's all enterprise anyways, you can really fine-tune that knob and choose the exact level of performance that you need for your environment. Sir? So the question is there any downtime associated with scaling? Yes, there is. I think, on both platforms, yeah, because things need to be resized a little bit. I'm not 100% sure on the DTU side. If anyone wants to chime in on this, but definitely on the when you involve instance level deployment, you definitely involve some downtime.
The DTU side does not, but the vCore will have some. But the most punitive that I found is the managed instance tier. It can be hours, which is horrible. But
I heard that, yeah. So there is actually a link at the bottom of that slide that points you to the DTU discussion and gives you more detail there. And then in addition to the ability to scale up and then down, you also have additional things that Microsoft is able to pull out of a hat is the concept of elastic pools, which is, think of it, okay, so the way I think of elastic pools is kind of database consolidation efforts. So if you remember, a while back, there were always big projects in trying to figure out how many databases can we fit on this one box, and what are the peak times, the up times, the low times? Can we merge these databases on the same instance from a performance standpoint? So elastic pools allow you to do this, and it's an offering that basically helps you kind of purchase a specific amount of DTUs that you can share across multiple databases. And then serverless compute is in preview, which allow you to have basically your service that basically shuts down if it's not being used, and so you don't pay for it as long as it's not being used. So that's really kind of the extreme scale down version of how far you can go, but that's currently in preview. Sir?
What about the snapshot? What about the snapshot capabilities between the two systems? Like, let's say that I, was running an application and I'm taking, hourly snapshots, and all of a sudden someone says, I want to, we've got a bad data, go spin off a replica. How quick can I do that in either of those systems? I know RDS is pretty good about that because it's taking volume snapshots, and I can just spin up an RDS instance from a snapshot. But what about Azure's offering?
So I think the discussion is your time to spin up databases in Azure is pretty quick when you deal with the single instance and the elastic pool environment. I think the gentleman pointed out that a managed instance is going to be potentially much slower. So I think it depends then in the offering you're in the Azure platform. I've created databases in just a couple of minutes on the Azure platform before. Yeah. So that brings me to my conclusion. And generally speaking, I find that some customers find it easier to go in the AWS platform just because it's simpler, because it matches the investment and the knowledge that people have in terms of how to deploy SQL Server in an instance-based environment. Because it has the ability to let you choose the actual version and the edition of the database engine that you want to deploy for SQL Server, you're much more likely to have a fork and lift experience that's going to be very successful. So from a backward compatibility, I think that's hard to match. Doesn't mean it'll work, because you have still certain limitations that we talked about earlier that could still be getting in the way, but definitely it'll be a little bit potentially easier in some cases. On the Azure side of things, however, if your applications work right off the bat, or if you're able to make some of the investments potentially necessary to upgrade your application stack to work with the latest binaries, you're going to get more availability out of the box, more security options, more scalability options, and then you'll always be on the latest binaries at the enterprise level. So you really have, kind of think through your migration process and where you want to go and which environment kind of best fits your scenario. Okay. That's it. Any questions? Yep. Thank you.
What's your opinion of the costs of one versus the other? Yeah.
So, okay, so this will be blog number 4. There is a significant, I spent a significant amount trying to compare cost, but it's very hard to compare if you don't have a very fixed scenario, because there are so many parameters and so many variables that come into cost. It's not even funny. But generally speaking, both platforms allow you to enter and try at no charge. There's a way for you to get in at no charge to try it. Azure has a few options. If you have an MSDN license, it's easier. AWS can give you up to 12 months of low-end entry-level type SQL Server instances, so you can try the experience. And then from there, it goes up and up and up and up. I'm going to say that the biggest drawback in AWS is that as soon as you want to enter the high availability, your cost literally doubles. And so if you're not ready for that, you might be really surprised. On the Azure side, I think cost management, you can still be surprised, because I have been on deploying my databases in the cloud. However, I was able to fine-tune and just get it down to just spending a few bucks a month. So I was able to really get, my dev test environment as cheap as possible. So I was able to get something that was working for me really well. So I'm sorry if it's not a precise answer, but.
I guess what I'm looking for is, do you find AWS cheaper in general, or Azure cheaper?
I can't answer that question because I have not tried it. So it's not like I have an application that has all these needs and I'm going to try to cost it in one and cost it in the other. There are, again, so many variables, it's virtually impossible to answer. What I can say, no, but it goes really deep in. Yeah, again, I think if you have an app and you know exactly what you need, then you can cost it in one and cost it in the other, and now you can compare. But because there are so many options beyond that, to have a generic answer is not possible. You need to have an actual.
I'm not looking for a generic answer per se. I'm looking for experience.
Mm-hmm.
Have you found that AWS, you got a SQL server in AWS and you got a SQL server in Azure?
So which edition? Let's start with this one. Which edition are you going after?
Which edition?
Yep.
Okay, 2017.
And standard edition, enterprise, standard edition. And you see where I'm going with this?
Apples to apples.
Yeah, but you don't have standard edition in Azure. And so my point is, that's really important, because I actually spent like weeks looking at costing. So I'm not giving you a generic answer that I'm actually telling you, it's very, very, very hard to compare. One of the factors that drove costs through the roof in AWS was to go to the Enterprise Edition, because you're limited to the instance size that you can choose from. So you cannot tune it down. It's very hard to go below a specific level, and as a result, you already start really high, right? So then there is also the discussion about having an environment, not just in production, but your dev, your test. Some enterprises also have a QA environment, a UAT environment that mirrors production. So when you look at all of these, which edition do you choose for every one of these? Because all of that goes into the total cost of ownership of your application, right? So I found out that some companies were really surprised to see at the bill at the end of the month when you start looking at all these environments where you have to literally fine-tune what you want. So let's say in UAT, are you going to turn on or off high availability in Amazon? So you're going to try to optimize your cost in Amazon as much as possible. So do you turn it off? Maybe you do, right? So if you turn it off, then it's half the price for that particular environment. In Azure, you can't, right? It's always there, right? So getting to an actual price comparison is very hard. But thank you for bringing that up, and this will definitely be a topic of a future blog that I'll put together. Yeah.
This is a follow-up question about the cost. So what does Azure or AWS charge? I mean, maybe they charge for the CPUs and the memory, not memory storage, or do they charge for the transactions? So maybe for the different models, they charge for different things. I'd like to know that.
Okay. Yeah, great question. So you will get charged for as many things as the service provider can find ways to charge you, right? So, but the answer differs on one and the other a little bit. So generally speaking, you'll pay for compute. So remember in Azure we talked about the DTU model versus vCore, right? So we have to choose one or the other. DTU is kind of a generic umbrella that gives you a rough range of operation. If you go beyond that, then your service may not be available. So it might tell you to retry, right? Because you go beyond your level of service. So you won't get charged for number of transactions per se, but what you'll get charged is for the level of service that you want. So it could be a number of cores, or it'll be how much of performance you need. Then you'll get charged for your storage. So how much data do you store? The storage aspect, right? Yeah, and the type of storage. So if you want, yeah, for sure. You'll be charged for your availability options. So your storage can be replicated or not. You'll be charged for, in the case of, let's say you want to do Active Directory integration, right? Now you'll have to also pay for the related services that you need to stand up in the various environments to get your Azure to get your Active Directory environment up and running. So in AWS, for example, you have something called MAD, which is Managed Active Directory. It's a service, but in order for you to have your SQL Server participate with Active Directory, you need to have MAD in place. So that's an extra cost, right? And then you have your backup cost. So if you want to be able to recover your things, you need to be able to enable your backups. That's cost. You have monitoring also that can come into play. If you want advanced monitoring, you're going to need to pay for extra services. So there is, yeah, egress. Yeah, that's right. Yes, yeah. You pay for data out. You don't usually pay for data in. Yeah. So there's that's, I think, in a nutshell, all the things that come into pricing your engine. I probably missed a few.
They both have pricing calculators.
Yes.
Somehow
yeah.
say that they're cheaper than the other guys.
Yeah.
It's difficult to use, but again, you've got to answer all these
Yes.
questions.
Yes.
At least see what the options are.
Right. Right. Yes.
This may be too nuanced for this discussion, but the business associate agreements from both companies, is there any difference on that? From a healthcare perspective, they need to sign business associate agreements. And I'm curious if you have any insight into one
I have not been.
versus the
I have heard about this before, but I was not directly involved. So unfortunately.
So a business associate agreement is required by HIPAA for privacy and security.
Yeah.
And so as part of that, every place that protected health information resides and that vendor and that service have to be under a business associate agreement, and that's enforceable by OCR. And the penalties that come along with not having that. You don't have to have a breach to get a penalty. So it becomes kind of a design issue up front.
Yeah, so I don't really have any background on that, but yeah, I'm sure. Yeah.
Well, yeah, AWS says they are if you follow X, Y, and Z. Like, it's very nuanced, and they have white papers on making your AWS instance HIPAA compliant. It's not out of the box HIPAA compliant.
Okay.
And so, but I haven't read too much
yeah,
about
that's
Azure.
another good topic for sure. Yes.
Not more than that, but you're correct. There are specific things that you have to adhere to in order for it to be HIPAA compliant. They provide all the capability for that, but unless, for example, if AWS is not encrypted by default at rest, so you have to encrypt, inside of AWS. You have to enable TDE on if you're building your own instance.
And so you have to have enterprise.
So that's on you, right?
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Ellen.
Hervé. I was late, so I don't know if you touched on reporting. Did you?
I know. I did not cover reporting tonight. Yes. It's a whole other topic. Yeah. Okay. But go ahead. Ask the question.
Yeah, because the question I had is, I know with Azure SQL reporting services, obviously didn't come across with that. And so they're recommending Power BI as the new reporting solution, or you'll have a VM running SSRS. I was wondering on the AWS side with RDS, have they done like a PaaS version of reporting services, or if it's similar, it needs to be a VM, running SSRS?
I honestly don't know. Good question. Does anyone has any insights on this? I mean, I know on the Amazon side, you have, since you're getting a full instance.
Well, the answer on the mic. I just don't want to keep answering everything.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thanks. You do have to build your own SSRS instance. Yep. Same with SSIS. Yep.
So if people want to know more about Azure, is there a user group available?
No, we started a new Microsoft South Florida Microsoft Cloud South Florida user group. Thank you. Yeah. So me and Darius and Celia and David Cobb back there. Is there? I did not, but I go along with everything because I get along, And so that's basically the third Thursday of each month at the Microsoft office in Fort Lauderdale. Microsoft Cloud South.
What? Yes.
Alphabet soup. All right. Thank you very much.
The name was chosen by somebody who was working for SEO, so they were choosing all the different words, I believe. Did I get that right? No. If it works, yes, absolutely.
So is anybody going to the Ignite show up in Orlando? It's a Microsoft. So Hervé's company will be there, and I'll be there helping as well. So I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, sure. Yep. So
double mic.
So yeah. So no one. So you're going to Ignite. Awesome. Anyone else? No. That's it. All right. So yeah, we'll. Yeah. So we'll be there. This is the first year that my company will be there as a on the floor as one of the vendors. So exciting, complicated, and it's going to be big for sure. And Dave has volunteered.
Oh, we're going to have fun.
Yes,
we're going to have a lot of fun.
Gracefully to help out.
What kind of gummy bears do you have?
Yeah. Gummy bears? Oh, yeah.
Blue ones?
So, yeah, we ordered blue gummy bears with the logo on top and stuff, so it's pretty cool. Yeah.
What kind of show is that?
Microsoft Ignite is Ignite, yeah. So we'll have about, it's the first week of November. Right. It's the whole week. Yeah. About 30 to 35,000 people show up to that event. Yeah, big show. Yeah. But because it's Orlando, I'm going. Might as well.
Are there any other announcements? Like what do you have coming up for Boca.js? Nada, yeah. I'm the same with October, or November, I mean, so. Does anybody want to speak next month at Coders Cafe?
Ooh.
Or at Boca.js?
Ooh.
And like I said, the workshop at IT Palooza is free. If you pay for IT Palooza, you get the JavaScript workshop for free.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Hervé.
Thank you, everyone.